Welcome to the deep dive. We often talk about economic recovery in, these simple letters.
Right, the V shape, the U shape.
The V-shaped bounce, the slow U-shaped grind, or that terrifying L-shaped stagnation. But what if those models just, fundamentally fail to capture what's really going on?
That's the core of what we're digging into today.
For the average person, I mean.
Exactly. For the past few years, the data has been sending these really conflicting signals. You see record-breaking wealth in some sectors, surging stock markets, and at the same time, this massive financial stress for most families.
It's a story of divergence.
A huge divergence. And the starkest visualization for it is the K-shaped economy.
And that K-shape is our mission today. We're going to take a deep look at two very different economies, the U.S. and South Korea, and map out that structural split. Then we're going to pivot to what's probably the biggest driver of all this in the future, artificial intelligence.
And we have to understand this K-shape not as some, temporary post-pandemic thing.
Right, it's not a blip.
It's a structural shift. The letter K just illustrates it perfectly. You have one segment, the upward stroke of the K, that's doing incredibly well.
Soaring assets, income growth.
And then you have the other segment, the downward stroke. That's just declining or stagnating. It's polarization, but it's a deep systemic split.
So we're not just talking rich versus poor. It's more like two separate economic realities running on these parallel but diverging tracks.
Precisely. The term really took off in 2020 because it captured that divergence in recovery paths. But now it's just the default state.
Okay, let's unpack this with the U.S. experience first. The analysis we have suggests the U.S. economy is, fully entrenched in this classic K-shaped model. And the divergence there cuts across not just income, but the absolute engine of the economy, consumer spending.
And this is so critical to understand. Private consumption makes up something like 70% of U.S. GDP.
Wow.
So if you're looking for the heart of the American economy, that's it. It's consumer spending. And if that heart relies on too few arteries, the whole system becomes fragile.
And here's the number that just jumped out at me from the material. Economic growth is driven by a shockingly small group of people.
Yeah.
The top 10% of income earners in the U.S. are responsible for half of the nation's total consumption.
Yeah.
And if you just widen that a little bit, the top 20% account for 2/3 of all consumption.
Just think about the implications of that for a second. When prosperity is that concentrated, the risk is concentrated too.
Right.
It means the economic engine isn't running on broad middle-class strength. It's being carried entirely by the spending habits of the affluent.
The upward stroke of the K is doing all the heavy lifting.
And what's caused this incredible reliance on that top 10%? Well, you have to look at the squeeze on everybody else.
It's inflation, but not the way we usually think about it.
That's right. It has disproportionately attacked the purchasing power of the middle and lower classes, the costs you literally cannot avoid.
Housing, childcare.
Medical care, transportation. These essential costs have surged way beyond the general inflation rate. So the lower half of the K is left with what the sources call consumption that can no longer be cut.
Meaning they've already cut everything else. The restaurant trips, the new clothes, all the discretionary stuff is gone.
It's gone. Now they're just covering necessities, and there's absolutely no headroom left to drive broader economic growth. Any growth we see is purely from the surplus of the very top.
Which is such an unstable foundation.
And you can see this translating directly into politics. This economic strain isn't some abstract concept anymore. It's a real cost of living crisis.
And politicians are rising who campaign on these specific pain points.
Exactly. The material highlights the election of Zoran Mamdani in New York. His whole platform was zeroed in on the housing crisis and childcare costs. That's the K-shape literally defining election outcomes.
So what's the big risk here? What's the takeaway?
The risk is that if the upward stroke of the K slows down, even a little bit,
Say if the top 10% just decide to pull back on luxury spending,
the entire U.S. economy faces a massive systemic shock. You've basically built an economy that relies on a perpetual champagne toast just to keep the lights on.
that grim picture in the U.S. really sets up a fascinating comparison. When we pivot to South Korea, the K-shape looks completely different.
But the structural anxiety might actually be even deeper.
What's so interesting is that the Korean consumption story isn't nearly as concentrated. The top 10% there account for about 20% of consumption.
Which is vastly lower than the 50% in the U.S.
So the engine isn't dependent on luxury shoppers in the same way.
No, not to the same degree. In fact, if you just look at overall income inequality, it might even look like it's stabilizing, especially when you factor in non-cash benefits like public health care and education.
So if income is stabilizing, shouldn't that ease the squeeze? I mean, why is the anxiety level so high?
Because the real K-shape there isn't in income. It's in assets, jobs, and regional growth. That's where the structure is being torn apart.
Let's pin down that asset gap. The sources show the average net worth of the top 20% of households was 44.9 times that of the bottom 20%.
It's an enormous gap, and it has widened dramatically over the last decade. This asset gap is the single greatest driver of social despair.
You have to understand, for you listening, this isn't just about money. It's about mobility.
Yes. The material points out that owning an apartment in Seoul, for instance, has become the symbolic benchmark for whether you're on the upward or downward stroke of the K. It's an entry ticket to class stability that's just out of reach for most young people.
And the data on youth sentiment it's just heartbreaking. Young Koreans have low relative poverty rates, 9th lowest in the OECD.
So their day-to-day income is relatively okay.
But their reported life satisfaction ranks near the absolute bottom globally.
Because the inability to build assets, especially housing wealth, makes it impossible to plan for a future. Your paycheck today doesn't matter if you feel like the ladder to stability has been pulled up.
That 44.9 times gap, it just overshadows everything else.
And this K-shape in Korea is sectoral too. It segments the whole society.
How so?
Well, you see it in jobs. Elderly employment is rising steadily, but often in low-wage sectors, just out of sheer necessity.
And at the same time,
Youth employment is stagnating. The economy is creating stability for older workers, but not opportunities for younger ones.
you also see it in industry. Exports are at a record high, which sounds great.
But that growth is overwhelmingly concentrated in one single area: semiconductors.
Right. So the rest of the manufacturing base, the small and medium businesses, they're just stagnant or even retreating.
The whole country's success is resting on one high-tech pillar. And then finally you see it in region. That semiconductor growth is all in the Seoul metro area and a few other high-tech clusters.
Leaving huge parts of the country behind.
Exactly. So the Korean K-shape is the split between a handful of hyper-productive, centralized industries and an increasingly marginalized rest of the economy.
So we've established this K-shape is a structural reality, whether you look at the U.S. consumption model or the Korean asset model. But now the sources point to AI and robotics as the core variables that will decide what happens next.
Right. This is where we sort of look into the crystal ball, because how we manage AI will decide if the upward stroke of the K just accelerates away into the stratosphere, or if we can somehow make those benefits flow back down.
Let's look at two radically different visions of the future from two of the biggest names in tech. First up, Elon Musk. He predicts that maybe within 15 to 20 years, AI and robotics will replace almost all human labor.
And this leads him to a pretty radical conclusion, not just universal basic income, UBI, but something he calls universal high income, UASIA.
Like the universal high income. That sounds like science fiction. I mean, isn't the political hurdle of just getting UBI past the real obstacle long before full automation?
That's the traditional view, but Musk's logic is fundamentally deflationary. That's what makes it so different. He argues that the, infinite productivity from AI and robots will push the marginal cost of almost everything towards zero.
So we stop worrying about income and start thinking about abundance.
Exactly. Abundance becomes the default, not scarcity. In this vision, money itself just loses its meaning as a tool for survival. It becomes, as he puts it, a resource allocation database.
Let's use that concrete analogy from the research. If high productivity means a bowl of jjajangmyeon that costs, say, the equivalent of 10,000 won today, suddenly drops to 1,000 won, that's a massive deflationary shift just from machine efficiency. If everything gets 90% cheaper, your income needs just plummets.
And that's the UHI concept. Your income doesn't have to be massive in absolute numbers because its purchasing power would be astronomically high. The cost of living would be almost negligible.
But then you've got Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, and he's pushing back hard against this whole end of labor idea.
Yeah, he offers a very different path for the future K-shape. What's so fascinating about his view is the nuance. He argues that AI replaces tasks, not entire jobs.
A crucial distinction.
It's everything for policymakers. The radiologist example is perfect.
Right.
Years ago, everyone predicted AI would make radiologists obsolete. But what actually happened? AI automated the repetitive, time-consuming tasks of image analysis.
Which increased their capacity.
Dramatically. It allowed them to see more patients, focus on complex cases, do more research. Demand for radiologists actually went up.
So instead of killing the job, AI just enhanced the human worker and made them more productive.
Precisely. And Huang extends this to physical labor. He predicts a whole new industry will be created just for maintenance and support. If his estimate is right, and we eventually have 1 billion robots,
A billion.
the industry to service and support those robots will become the world's single largest industry, creating millions of new high-value jobs.
So this collision of visions, Musk's abundance on one side and Huang's new jobs on the other, it suggests that there's no single silver bullet policy.
No, any advanced nation has to prepare for both. You have to create jobs in the short to mid-term, Huang's path, but you also have to redesign the distribution system for the long term, Musk's path.
The practical, immediate strategy has to be creating those AI-adjacent jobs now. For a place like Korea, this means leveraging their strengths in manufacturing and robotics.
And you can do that by strategically using advanced sensors and vision tech to capture the skilled movements of expert human technicians.
Creating digital twins.
Exactly. That real-world data is gold. It's what you feed the AI learning models. This drives the development of next-gen AI factories and data centers, and that whole build-out phase generates huge employment before full automation takes the old jobs away.
And you have to pair that with aggressive youth apprenticeship program.
Absolutely. You have to train the next generation for these new roles.
Okay, so that handles the short-term job K-shape. But if we accept that the long-term arrow points toward Musk's world, where human labor just structurally declines,
then basic income stops being a welfare debate.
And becomes a necessity for systemic transition.
It's about liquidity. It's about stability. The source material projects a hypothetical for Korea in 2040. If the government budget is, say, 1,500 trillion won, and the population is 40 million, even allocating half of that to basic income could yield about 1.5 million won per person per month.
18 million won a year, a solid safety net.
But here's where the Musk multiplier, that deflation, changes the game. That 1.5 million won per month could have the purchasing power of what 3 million won buys today.
A level that's hard to reach now even with a minimum wage job.
Exactly. So the future, in theory, promises a decent standard of living without the constant precarious labor we see today.
But the hurdle is immense. How do you pay for this transition? Especially if your main source of funding, the labor income tax, is shrinking.
Well, that's the obvious problem. If robots create the wealth and humans lose their labor income, the tax base collapses.
Right.
Experts like Professor Seo Young-suk from KAIST, they're predicting a shock similar to the Great Depression, maybe 25% unemployment, by 2035 if we don't reform the tax system now.
And their solution is pretty radical.
It has to be. Expanding digital taxes and robot taxes.
So taxing the machines?
The core principle has to shift. The future distribution structure must tax the ultra-productivity and assets generated by AI, robots, and capital, not scarce human labor income. Basic income funding isn't charity. It's a proactive redesign of the system.
Okay, let's wrap this up. We started by seeing the K-shape defining consumer vulnerability in the U.S. and creating deep asset anxiety in Korea. We then saw these two future paths driven by AI, the creation of new high-tech jobs from Huang, and the need to redesign our whole distribution system from Musk.
And the fundamental insight is that this K-shape isn't just happening by accident. It's being actively driven by concentrated growth in a few highly technical sectors like semiconductors and AI.
So managing this requires more than just safety nets.
It demands strategic investment in the very technologies causing the shift. You have to ensure that the upward stroke of the K is accessible, or at least that its bounty is shared.
And that strategic investment, that future distribution, requires a massive social and political consensus. You have to agree to fund it with things like robot taxes and digital taxes. So here's the final thought for you to mull over. If AI really does create this ultra abundance and capital becomes infinitely productive, will society be able to agree on how to define and tax the value created by a machine? Or will the K-shape just accelerate, making that split permanent?